In this module, we're moving on to the middle part of the course where we're looking at depth, at an in-depth focus on some of the major sources that you use in research. So we're going to start this week with a focus on rules, which is primarily around statutes and regulations, and we move on to cases, theory, using research, using data, before we move into the last run of the course, which really focuses on the preparation of research materials. So this week we're looking at rules, and you might be thinking, oh no, not statutory interpretation again, we've done that before. And yes, we're looking at statutory interpretation again, but we're looking to revisit that knowledge and to think about it in a slightly different way, and to move beyond the relatively passive way you might have thought of legislation in the past, where as a researcher it's about going and finding something that's already out there, and moving to a more critical mode where you can actually start evaluating legislation, understanding how it works, understanding the limitations on the format, and the way in which going forward, if you are in a position where you need to draft rules, the sort of conditions under which you do that. And we're looking much more broadly too than just legislation. We're also going to have a bit of a focus on regulations, which are increasingly where we regulate our society. Even though it's something that as lawyers we tend to, think is the less sexy part of the law. Local bylaws, codes of conduct, all these things seem less exciting than, cases before the High Court or legislation before Parliament. But it's increasingly the site in which our society is regulated, and it's very, very important. So we also, I think, it's helpful to think of these more broadly as rule systems, and not just to think that there's something special or elevated about law as a set of rules, and that at different scales we work within rule systems every day, and think about the way in which rulemaking it works in the broader social context. And what rulemaking is about really is about codification of some broad concepts, broad ideals, often very abstract ideals, within words, finding a set of rules that defines how you go forward. Now that can be the criminal code, but it can also be the rules of politeness by which we engage in conversation. It can be the rules of a game, it can be the rules of sport. It can be very different levels of formality or informality, but it's a core human activity, and as lawyers we're specialists in that field. And we also know that people have different attitudes around rules, and we start seeing the same attitudes appear, whether it's people who are compliance focused, people who always skirt the edges of rule system and always try to fit just within the rules. They're the literal minded people who try and follow the rules to the letter of the way they're written, even if that might be an absurd thing to do. And there are people who are obsessed with rule breaking for the sake of rule breaking. So there's a whole variety of different human activities that we can see in the law at large, but we can also see it in a backyard cricket match or a game of Monopoly. And that's something that's deeply interesting, because the more we understand the way we as humans relate to rules, the more I think we can understand how we govern ourselves and how effective things are. And we start thinking about the way in which people engage, and sometimes is it enough that people just comply with a rule system? That's fine, that's all we expected them to do. But in other circumstances we want people to change their behaviour or to change the way they think, and in which case we're not looking for compliance driven behaviour. And ultimately, this is part of the broader question that is a high concern of law, and one which we don't really spend enough time talking on within the law program, and that's governance. How do we govern ourselves as a society, as a set of different societies in a globalized world? These are emerging big questions, and to engage with these, you move beyond the narrow focus you start with, which is, can you find Section 64A of the Sale of Goods Act? Yes, I can find that, into understanding how these systems work broadly and being able to take that critical view and evaluate them. So the workshop this week will focus on the construction of a regulatory network map. This is something I'm sure you've never done before, but it's something that takes the old legal way of thinking into that visual thinking model that we've been working on throughout this term in mind maps and so on, and actually looking at how do all these different bits and pieces of regulation work together. And, you know, the old model of simple model of lawmaking is you create an act and that act regulates a certain set of behaviours. But today we've got interlocking jurisdictions, interlocking legislative schemes, interlocking agencies, each of which have a different piece of the pie when it comes to regulation, and each of those will have their own internal regulation and guidelines. And you can end up in extremely complex situations, and even in relatively straightforward areas of law, like say criminal law, you can end up with multiple agencies interacting and clashing with each other. Now, if you think of things that are more complex, say telecommunications regulation, you're going to end up with lots of different agencies bumping heads with each other. And the purpose of thinking about regulatory mapping is being able to get that stuff sorted out in your own head and being able to understand how it all fits together, how all the interlocking moving parts of the system work, and also I think to act as a way of looking for things you might have missed, where you might think about a legislative scheme and say, oh, it does this and this and this, but you might, if you don't think about it clearly and carefully, miss the question of, well, who actually polices this? Who enforces this? And that stuff is extremely important to understand. So we're moving well out of hierarchy here, and we're moving well into that field of what a legal professional does, beyond simply providing simple, straightforward advice. Because that's the sort of thing that computers are going to be doing before too long. That sort of lawyering is very much on its way, easing its way out, although someone has to program the computers. But the new models of lawyering that are coming out are much more at that higher analytical level. And I think that's exciting. Who wants to be doing a job that a robot could do? All right. So the readings this week are basically a revision of stuff you already know on statutory interpretation, but I don't think it hurts to revise that and to go over it again and to pick up the things that you've probably forgotten, because let's face it, that's what happens when you study. As soon as you start something new, you forget all the stuff you've done beforehand. And this is one area of skill that you need to concentrate on again and again and again to get better at it. It's not like you can do statutory interpretation 1 and go done and dusted, that's it, I know how to do it. It's something you need to be able to do repeatedly and build on that experience. The equilibrium section this week talks about the Feynman technique, which is a way of learning by teaching someone else how to do something. And I encourage you to think about this, particularly in areas of law which you're finding difficult and conceptually hard to get a grip on. Find someone, some poor person who can't run away from you, and teach them how to do it. Find a younger sibling and teach them the basic of statutory interpretation. I'm sure they won't thank you for it. But the process of being able to try and explain something and break it down is the best way to learn it. And Feynman was someone who very much pioneered that as a technique. And is an interesting physicist in his working life, in all other areas. So it's I don't want to create the assumption that all Richard Feynman did was create a teaching technique. He's a very important physicist, but he was also known as a great teacher, and part of his legacy is helping us to come up with these techniques for help us with learning. So the workshop this week is about regulatory mapping, and of course you're going to focus that on your project around drink driving. As I said, criminal law is something we often think of as very simple, and in many ways it's some of the most simple areas of law. You've got a provision that prohibits something, provides a penalty, people get caught, they go to trial, they get convicted or acquitted, and then there's a sentence. But there are so many agencies involved along the way. There's the policing aspect, there's the corrections aspect, the traffic authorities, each of which are going to be involving different sets of legislation and different acts that guide what they do. Any particular new innovation, such as suggested in the law reform program, is going to require a regulatory framework to underpin it. And that may come through legislation, it may require something at that level, but a lot of it may require creation of regulations that don't necessarily go through Parliament, that amend existing laws and amend existing sentencing guidelines. And that's a really great example of what we're going to talk about in one of the other videos, is that difference between formal legislation and the less formal regulations that sit underneath it, is those regulations can be amended in a simple way and by annotation by the correct people, but by being recorded in the Government Gazette, and not with the expense of going to the Parliament and having to pass a whole new act through, or an amendment to an act. So there's lots of great examples out of our chosen area, I think, which will illustrate this work. But as I said at the outset, I think one of the important things that will hopefully come out of this week is to start to transition your thinking from that introductory level, where you're really focusing on just where can I find this stuff, where can I find legislation, to being able to be someone who is a critical user of legislation, someone who understands legislation, and someone who is thinking about rules generally. And hey, it might take the fun out of playing a game of Monopoly or Pandemic or whatever it is, chess, whatever it is you like to play, to start thinking about rule systems. But I think it's something that actually adds a whole interesting level of analysis, that as lawyers you start seeing the world differently, and you start thinking very much in terms of effectiveness of rule systems, the way in which people modify rules, the way in which people modify the rules of cricket for a game of backyard cricket, tells you a lot about people and the way they interact. Anyway, this video's gone on way too long. We'll get onto it in the workshops this week.